Katie. We have The Sign of the Twisted Candles. We are on Chapter 8, Eavesdropper. In the name of the law, I demand that you stop! Peter Boonton shouted as he entered the tower room. Don't pay any attention to him, Jacob Sidney answered coolly. Nancy saw Asa Sidney in his favorite chair near the great twisted candle. Standing at a nearby table was Carson Drew, staring calmly over his shoulder at the intruders. Raymond Hill was seated at the table, a pen in his hand. Apparently he had just finished using it because he capped the pen and returned it to his pocket. What branch of the law do you represent? Mr. Drew asked the newcomers, gathering up papers. Boonton stood stock still, his mouth opening and closing. I'm not an officer, he said finally. But hasn't a relative any right in a case like this? A case like what? Mr. Drew asked. I've just finished drawing Mr. Asa Sidney's will, which Mr. Hill here has witnessed. Is there anything illegal about that? I demand to see the document, Jacob Sidney announced, striding forward. To be sure, this is the document of a person who is mentally sound. I assure you that it is, the lawyer said, somewhat annoyed. Jacob spoke up. We don't want to put any ideas into the old man's head. The remark angered Nancy. Her father's code of justice was rigid and unyielding. Her blue eyes flashing, she said, Mr. Sidney, I think you owe my father an apology, and Mr. Asa Sidney too. Jacob Sidney gave an ingratiating smile. So he's trying to, play nice now. Little spitfire, eh? Who are you anyhow? Everybody seems to be running this show except those who should be. Angry, Asa Sidney rose and faced his relatives. Why is it, he said, that you have left me alone for over 2 years and have suddenly become concerned about my mental condition and my affairs? Is it because you suspect I won't last long and you want my money? I assure you I am just as able to take care of my own business today as I was 2 years ago. I don't doubt it, Uncle Asa, Jacob Sidney said in mollifying tones. So he's trying to, make him not angry anymore. To mollify is to try and soothe somebody. I just want to warn you against putting too much confidence in strangers. And not only strangers, but scheming relatives, Peter Boonton interjected. You must know that I have your best interests at heart, Uncle Asa. Just the same, said the old man, a stranger may prove to be a great friend. He clapped Nancy on the shoulder, finally letting his arm rest there affectionately. He turned to his nephews. When I need your advice, I'll send for you, he said testily. I was only trying to help, Jacob muttered. Do you really wish to be of service to me? Asa asked, a twinkle in his eyes. Yes, indeed, Jacob replied, eager to ingratiate himself to the old man. So he's trying to get in good with the old man. Let me do it, Peter offered, thrusting himself forward. Well, you may both do it, Asa said, stroking his long beard. What shall we do? chorused his nephews. Get out! Asa thundered in a tone that surprised everyone. Get out of here and stay out until I ask you to come back. You've sickened me, both of you. You think I have money and you're fluttering around me like a pair of vultures waiting for me to die. Go! His nephews paled at their scheme being exposed like this before the lawyer, the banker, and most of all, before a young girl. Nancy felt Asa's hand tremble as it rested on her shoulder. He swayed as he clung for a moment to her arm to steady himself. His nephews backed toward the door. Nancy feared that another outburst from old Asa would seriously sap his feeble strength, so she slipped toward the door to speed the men's departures. Please, be calm and reasonable, Peter Boonton said in a low, soothing tone. I was impetuous, so he was kind of impulsive. He was acting without thinking. And I beg you to bear me no ill will, Uncle. Asa wearily signaled to Nancy to open the door. She grasped the knob and swung the door inward. Oh! She exclaimed. Frank Jemmett was crouched just outside. I dropped something. He stammered. The innkeeper stared at Nancy and the others in dismay. I dropped something, he repeated. It was when I was cleaning this morning. You were eavesdropping, Peter Boonton said, advancing toward the man. Never, Gemmet wailed. I wouldn't do such a thing. He teetered for a moment on the top step, then with a yell of fright toppled over and rolled headlong down the stairs. He picked himself up on the landing. Are you hurt? Nancy gasped. I'll sue you, Boonton, for causing me to lose my balance, Gemmet shouted, rubbing his head in one shin. I might have broken my neck. Frank, Asa called, when you get all the way down, open the front door for these two gentlemen. All but Peter and Jacob smiled. The two men silently descended the stairway. As they vanished, Asa Sidney sighed deeply. I hope they never return. I'll tell you a secret about your family, said Nancy. They're not all like your nephews. The two girls who were here with me to celebrate your birthday are Bess Marvin and George Fane. Well, well, Asa Sidney said, a smile coming over his face. I'm glad to hear there are a few charming people in my family tree. Mr. Hill said he must return to the bank. He shook hands with Asa Sidney, then spoke to Nancy's father. I didn't know that acting as a witness to the signing of a will could become such an interesting adventure. And, Carson, I'll certainly remember all you told me at our little conference. Is there anything further? No, I'm sure you understand the general situation as well as I do, Mr. Drew replied. Shall Nancy drive you back to the bank? No, that won't be necessary, Mr. Hill said. I'll phone my chauffeur, who is no doubt waiting there for me, and have him come here. It must be very close to lunchtime. I don't have to consult my watch to agree with you, Mr. Drew smiled. How about you, Nancy? I could eat. Indeed I could, but I can wait too. Good. I want to question Gemmet, her father said. Well then, goodbye for the present, Raymond. As he left the tower, and Mr. Drew paused in the doorway and for another word with old Mr. Sidney, soft footfalls were heard on the stairs. Carol appeared, carrying a loaded tray. I made some sandwiches, she said shyly, and a pitcher of cocoa. Wonderful, wonderful, the lawyer exclaimed. And you must eat with us, Carol. I should like to become better acquainted with you. Carol is a very good girl, and my only comfort and helper, Asa Sidney said. My dear child, sit here beside me. You look very, very tired. I'm not tired, really, the young waitress replied stoutly, putting the tray on the table and lifting the cloth that covered it. Now, please help yourselves. I can't stay because some people have arrived here and I must serve them. She hurried off and the others began to eat. When they finished, Nancy said, Did Mr. Hill tell you then about the chest I put in the bank vault? No, they answered. Mr. Sidney, Nancy went on, did you ask Mr. Gemmet to bury your chest that used to be under that table? She pointed. The old man looked at the spot in amazement. Why, no, of course not. What do you know about it? Nancy told her story and added, I hope I did the right thing. Anyway, here's the receipt. She took it from her handbag and handed it to Mr. Sidney. You certainly used your head, the old man told her. Thanks. Then he chuckled. Outwitting Gemmet, who's 3 times your age, is an accomplishment. You're proud of her, aren't you, Mr. Drew? The lawyer looked grave. This is a very serious matter, Nancy. I'm relieved that everything turned out all right, but I think we should ask Gemmet for an explanation of his actions. He went downstairs, and a few minutes later returned with the manager of the Twisted Candles. Frank Gemmet was told about the chest. A look of fright came over his face for the fraction of a second. Then he said smoothly, Sure, I took the chest. Mr. Sidney slept later than usual, and I was afraid those conniving relatives of his would come up here and steal it. I assume the contents are valuable? Asa Sidney did not reply. He seemed to be lost in thought. Nancy and her father exchanged glances. They doubted Gemmet's story, but had to admit that his motive might have been an honest one. All right, Frank, Asa Sidney said finally. I accept your explanation, but don't take anything more out of this house. The innkeeper bowed and without a word hurried off. Asa Sidney said to the Drews, "There are valuable papers and some silver pieces in the chest." Nancy had speculated correctly. After a pause, he added, "I realize I am at a great disadvantage being up here alone. Perhaps I depend too much on Carol to keep me informed on the management downstairs." Nancy thought, "And Carol's too considerate to upset him by telling him about the way she's treated and the run-down condition of the inn." A faraway look came into the old man's eyes. "It is my turn to reveal a secret. My memory isn't what it used to be. My dear wife and I had camouflaged cupboards built into this house and hid many things of hers and mine in them, but I've forgotten where they are. She took hers away. Let's hope the rest haven't been found and stolen. I hereby appoint you, Nancy and Carol, and your friends, Bess and George, to do some searching. But one word of caution. It must be done without the knowledge of the Jennets." "Oh, I'd love that!" Nancy exclaimed. "Okay, Dad?" Her father nodded approval, and she grinned happily. "But I'll have to eat an awful lot of meals here and call on you very often to make my sleuthing look natural." "Remember," the old man warned, "secrecy, secrecy." Ooh.